Happy Friday, everyone. Here we are again. It is time for COPD Navigator Live, our weekly look inside the world of COPD, what's new and exciting in treatments and everything else that is COPD related. My name is Mike Hess. I am a respiratory therapist and COPD educator. I run a group here on Facebook, COPD Navigator, with an associated page. You can go right down to either of those links below. We also do these videos every Friday right around noontime Eastern. We try to get them archived onto the YouTube channel on this side of the screen. It's been going a little bit slow this week. Admittedly, I had a little bit of technical issue last week. Been trying to edit some of that stuff out, but should get last week's episode up in fairly short order, and then we'll get kind of a two-for a double header going and get this week's up as well. This week we have a very important topic to discuss. The topic of the day is, of course, having the talk. In this context, it's not quite the talk that you have with your kids, but, well, you do have it with your kids, but this is one that comes on later in life. This is a difficult conversation that a lot of people have about making your wishes known, end-of-life care, palliative care, hospice care, all that kind of stuff. Not necessarily fun, but extremely important so that you are taken care of even when you may not be able to speak for yourself. So before we get started, as we often do, first off, hello to everybody who's joining in today. We do want to cover a few things in the news world, the news aspect of COPD, and of course the big topic this week was the National Institutes of Health had a follow-on event from the development of the National Action Plan going on 2 years ago now. And this week they had an event in Bethesda, Maryland called the NIH COPD and Rural Health Dialogue. This was an event where that brought together, again, many stakeholders from every aspect of COPD care. We had respiratory therapists, we had people living with COPD, we had pulmonologists, we had representatives from the COPD Foundation. A lot of people coming together to discuss how things are going to be implemented, especially in rural health. Earlier this month here on Live, we talked about a new survey that came out that found that COPD is actually slightly more prevalent in the rural community as it is compared to a lot of the more urban areas of the country. And so, of course, this is going to be a major component of management of COPD going forward. The rural areas of the country have very specific barriers to adequate care, including access to pulmonology, access to pulmonary rehab, access to primary care even. And we need to work together to overcome some of those barriers and bring down a lot of this stuff. This did cover as I said, the COPD National Action Plan, a document that I'm proud to say I had a role in developing, and hopefully we're going to see a little bit more of that implementation. I understand in the new budget that is working its way through Congress and potentially to be signed into law. There is a significant increase in funding for NIH, and so hopefully COPD will get a piece of that new pie, because COPD research is, of course, massively underfunded, and that is, of course, one of the goals of the National Action Plan, to try and improve a lot of that stuff. So fingers crossed, we'll see if we can move forward on that stuff. At the link underneath there at copd.nih.gov, I have been assured that those of you who weren't able to attend or, like me, weren't able to catch all of the live stream that they had on Monday, the recording of the event will be available soon, any day now, so you will be able to access that through that website below and get more information and see a lot of friends of Navigator on the screen. I was glad to see a lot of that. Also this week in new studies that have come out, of course, electronic cigarettes, vape pens, whatever you want to call them, often a very controversial topic in the world of COPD. Of course, many people get COPD from cigarette smoke. I believe we're looking at about 70-75% of the people with COPD out there did get that through cigarette smoke, and so we're always looking at alternatives to that, and there's been a lot of back and forth about whether these new electronic cigarettes can be an acceptable substitute to help people quit smoking, or what their role is going to be as we move into the next generation, or how are new smokers or how are young people going to adapt to that. So there's been a lot of controversy. A couple weeks ago we talked about how, I believe it was the the American Cancer Society. One of our big national organizations came out with a position statement that said, while electronic cigarettes are not fantastic, they do have a potential role for people who have not had success with other forms of smoking cessation. Now, of course, the flip side to that, new study that came out, published in an open access journal called PLOS1, looked at the potential results for tobacco cessation at the population level, looking at it not in the individual for smoking cessation. Yes, the American Cancer Society. Thank you, David. Looking at things not necessarily at the individual level to help people quit smoking, but looking at it as more the overall population level. And what they found, this group out of New Hampshire at the Dartmouth Hitchcock Norris Cotton Cancer Center, found that while continued use at the current levels of use, electronic cigarettes would help about 2,070 people quit smoking, which is good. Unfortunately, we would also see that about 168,000 teens and young adults would likely start smoking. And even though the more research is out there, the more it seems to be that these electronic cigarettes are at least somewhat less harmful than traditional tobacco combustible cigarettes, that translates into about 1.5 million years of life lost due to these electronic cigarettes. This is based on census reports and usage reports and surveys and all that stuff. So again, while we see that at the individual level we may see some benefit from getting people to quit smoking with the use of these electronic cigarettes, overall, if we look at an entire population level, they probably are still doing more harm than good. And so now the pendulum swings back to not looking so positive for the e-cig, vape pens, and all that kind of stuff. Again, as a worst case scenario, if you absolutely have not been able to find anything else that helps you quit smoking, they may be helpful individually, but we do need to definitely be careful about how we look at nicotine and electronic cigarette policy as we go forward. On our last topic, our last news topic for the day is actually kind of related to our major overall topic. And of course, that's why I wanted to throw that in there. There was another new study that came out in the International Journal of COPD that looked at whether people with COPD and the people who are caring for them can have a similar understanding about how severe symptoms are. So this group, which came out of England, looked at 119 patients and their caregivers in the UK. They're called carers, but we're looking at the people taking care of those people, and asked them to rate various symptoms on a 4-point scale. These symptoms included constipation, diarrhea, gastrointestinal stuff, as well as depression, fatigue, anxiety, and breathlessness. And what they found was, at best, there was only what they considered to be a moderate agreement between the people living with COPD, these were relatively advanced cases of COPD, and the people taking care of them. The gastrointestinal stuff had the best association, which probably makes some sense because it's a fairly obvious thing to notice. If you have somebody who is having various gastrointestinal distress issues, it's fairly obvious. But depression, fatigue, anxiety, and breathlessness were a little less clear. There was only a fair relationship between the carer and the patient in evaluating the symptom burden there. They found that carers tended to overestimate, at least compared to the patients, when they were not, when they had a non-spousal relationship, when you had either a stranger or another family member who wasn't a spouse coming in and taking a look at these symptoms. Also, non-cohabitating, people who didn't live with the patient, tended to overestimate the symptom burden. And carer anxiety and depression, and carer unmet support needs. So as people were, as the carers, as the caregivers were not feeling supported themselves, they also tended to perhaps project some of that onto the person with COPD and assume that their symptoms were a little bit heavier than the person felt. In cases where the patient was overestimating compared to the carer, that tended to happen in people who were a little bit younger and in people who were had COPD for a longer amount of time. So the biggest takeaway from this is in the conclusion here. where the researchers stated overall agreement between patients and carers was only fair to moderate and was poor for more subjective symptoms. Again, that's your breathlessness, your anxiety, your depression, all that kind of stuff. There is a need to encourage open dialogue between patients and carers to promote shared understanding, help patients express themselves, and encourage carers to draw attention to symptoms that patients do not report. A lot of times, I'm sure many of you have gone through this, where whether you're taking care of somebody or being taken care of yourself, you don't necessarily want to be a burden, you don't want to weigh anybody down, so you underreport some of those symptoms, which is why it's so important for people who are taking care of you to be able to better evaluate and assess that symptom level. These findings suggest a need to screen for and address both the psychological morbidities in patients with advanced COPD and their carers, as well as unmet support needs in carers. So again, basically what we're looking at is we need to do a better job as a medical community and as a patient caregiver community to make sure that we're all talking to each other. Many of you, especially if you're longtime fans of the program, have heard me talk about the whole idea of rowing the boat before, where we're all in a boat together, me, the respiratory therapist, your primary care provider, your pulmonologist, your pharmacist, your family members, anybody who's taking care of you. We're all in a boat together. And if we're not talking to each other and we're not telling each other what we need and what we expect and all that stuff, at best we're going to row our little boat around in a circle. More likely we're going to flip the thing over and then we're all in trouble. But if we can be open and we can understand each other a little bit more and we clearly communicate needs and expectations and all that stuff, then we can actually coordinate our efforts appropriately and get ourselves from point A to point B. Point A being wherever you are right now, and point B is living your best life. So hopefully we can get on that path and move things forward appropriately. So that is a brief summary of the news features of the week. Next up, we're kind of testing out a new feature here, COPD Navigator Live. And again, I want to point out, if any of you have any questions or anything like that, whether they're related to any of the news topics we've talked about today, whether they're the topic of the day, anything else, please feel free to throw them depending on which screen you're looking at. They could be below, it could be off to the side, could be wherever it is, but feel free to throw those questions out there. We will address those toward the end of the program here. However, a new feature of the day, last week we started with kind of a product evaluation. We got the Masimo pulse ox device. We talked a little bit about a lot of people like to have pulse oximeters at home, and they are very helpful in certain cases with exercise and stuff like that. And we took a look at this model. Probably should have chose a better finger there, sorry about that. But we looked at this model that connects to your phone, Android, iOS, whatever it is, and gives you some nice readouts. The nice part of that is that this is a very clinical level device, works very well. Downside was that it was relatively expensive. So I went ahead and ordered a competing device, again, not one you need a prescription for, from another company called Nonin, which I never could figure out if it was Nonin or Nonin for a while, and then they started talking about how it was non-invasive, so I'm assuming we're going to go with Nonin these days. So this device is called the GoTo Achieve. This is something that you can get online in many places. I believe they do have it on Amazon. I got this from a source where I could use my flexible spending account dollars fairly easily, so that was easy for me to obtain that, and that's something, of course, you can do as well. We're going to put it over here in the light. This comes in a couple of different colors. I opted for orange for, COPD awareness. Got to be every day I'm hustling, right? We got to do, it does come in blue and in green as well, and I think it comes in black also if you want to go a little bit more plain. This is a pretty solid device. It is, again, much like the Masimo device that we looked at last week. This is professional level technology without a prescription. This is basically the same stuff that Nonin uses in a lot of their hospital devices, a lot of their physician offices devices. It is not necessarily tested out as a medical device so that they can sell it without a prescription. We also see that this device does have a waveform monitor after a fashion. Put it on this finger here. we can see that, if we can get that in focus here, we can see that as it's picking up the pulse, you see a little bit, it's a heart icon, that pulse is up there, and that's what's telling you that you're getting a good waveform. We want to make sure that you're getting, not just that you're getting a number, but that you're getting a high quality number. With the Masimo device, we see that, let me pull the screen back up here because it went away for reasons that are unclear. There we go. And come on, there we go. With this particular device, we can see that it's searching for my pulse. There it is. We get the nice, the big actual waveform on there. We see that it is quite noticeable, and here it is a little less so, but we do see that there is a pulse device there, and we see that there's pretty good agreement between my two fingers here, between the pulse and the pulse oximeter, but between like 1% or so, which tells us that these devices are working pretty close to each other. We also see with this that we don't necessarily have tracking. One of the nice things about having the device on the phone or tablet or whatever is that it will keep some records for you, and you can kind of trend things out a little bit more. It's we use it. We've been using it for doing oxygen tests to make sure that people are on supplemental oxygen. We can kind of trend that as they're walking through the course. That is not an option on here. This is kind of a spot check device only, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just wanting to put that out there as one of the features or one of the considerations. This one does have the display can be a little bit hard to read. This is a little bit fancy. Of course, when you have it on the phone, you can turn the brightness up and down. You can do whatever you need to do with them. But this one can be a little bit harder to read, especially in lower light conditions, and because it is a little bit more of a passive display, the old school LCD, that sort of thing. Just trying to keep up with some of the comments here, but let's see. We're going on to this one is only moderately expensive. Again, we looked at the Masimo last week. That was about $250. We do see a lot of those pulse oximeters down there that are in the $20 to $30 range. They can work, but they are far less reliable. They use much lower quality components to keep those costs down. They're assembled in some kind of sweatshop somewhere. And they tend to break pretty easily and all that kind of stuff. This is fairly durable. This is fairly high quality. It's going to run you a little bit more. This was on the order of, I believe, I was going to look up my receipt and I totally forgot. This was about $75 though. Not cheap. That's why I put moderately inexpensive instead of cheap or inexpensive, but certainly a lot more affordable than the Cadillac device that is the Masimo. So this can work for a lot of people. It's a good device. This would probably get, if I was doing a straight up recommendation, I would probably go with this device over the Masimo, simply because of the cost. They are very similar in their data quality. They are very similar in reliability. There are a few more bells and whistles on the Masimo that connects to the phone, but this one is a very solid device for anybody who is not necessarily obsessed with their pulse oximetry, but needs to keep a look at it while they're exercising and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be worth it, in my opinion, as a clinician, to save up a little bit more or use a different kind of, if you have access to flexible spending, if you're still in the workplace and your employer offers that. Save up a little bit and go for the higher quality device, because this is what's going to get you the data that you really need and is a little bit more reliable. Again, I know you can save some money going with the cheap stuff, but that might work for a Game Boy or something like that, but this is something that you might have to rely on sometime, and I would go for the quality. So that is our news for the day, and so that is going to take us into our topic. And I went with the title of calling it The Talk, because as I said before, usually we think of the talk as something you have with your kids, the birds and the bees and all that stuff. But this is kind of the bookend to that. This is later in life, when things are, when you're a little bit older, when you're a little bit sicker, you're a little bit concerned about what's going on toward the end of your life. This is not a comfortable conversation for a lot of people to have, because we have a lot of lot of angst about that in our society. However, to be blunt, everybody does come to an end eventually. I'm dealing with that myself a little bit. Many of you may know, a couple weeks ago my grandmother passed, and I'm her sole heir at this point, and so it's fallen to me to kind of take care of wrapping up a lot of her affairs. And even though I was in a position where my wife and I have both been very staunch advocates of planning and all that stuff, we've made sure we've got kids in high school. They know what our wishes are. They're prepared. They're getting prepared for a lot of that stuff as they enter adulthood. I'm discovering that I didn't even know what I didn't know at that point. So I'm trying to save people some of the issues later on. Again, this is an issue that often goes undercovered in our society and in many others, actually. And that, believe it or not, is not just my opinion. There was a study a few years back in the European Respiratory Journal, which is a very well-respected journal, that was covering this exact issue. This was a very highly powered study. This is what they call a meta-analysis, where they actually looked at a lot of previously written research on end-of-life care. You can see the title, Palliative and End-of-Life Conversations, specifically in COPD. They looked at all the literature that was out there. There was a couple of dozen studies that had been done about these conversations, and what they found, their conclusions were the frequency and quality of these end-of-life conversations are generally poor. Both patients and physicians alike identified a lot of barriers to having these kind of high-quality conversations, including a lack of time, a lack of feedback from the person with COPD to the clinician, and vice versa. The complex process of discharge planning, when you have COPD, especially some of the more advanced cases, when you're worried about oxygen and nebulizer supplies and this medication and that medication and hopefully pulmonary rehab and a lot of other stuff, sometimes things get a little bit lost in the mix. Sometimes people are in a bit of a state of denial about their conditions. I went through that. To be honest, my grandmother was in a little bit of denial about that stuff. I've gone through denial in the past with things like weight and knee pain and stuff like that. It's not something you want to look at when things are going wrong with your health. It's something many people try to put off as often as they can. And finally, of course, emotional distress. Again, this is not a pleasant conversation for anybody to have with anyone, whether it's a family member, whether it's a clinician, whether it's a counselor, whoever it is. This is not something people aspire to have. This is not something people like to talk about. So I appreciate everybody sticking in there with me today and having this crucial conversation, and so that we can come together a little bit and save some trouble down the line, hopefully. Additional barriers to this can be the tension between trying to have hope for the hope and the reality. Oftentimes we want to see that full recovery. We want to see the getting better and all that stuff, but sometimes the reality is a little bit more complicated than that, and we struggle with that, and that causes a tension in minds and in conversations, because we want to be realistic, but we also want to be hopeful and optimistic. And that has led to a case or a situation where most of these conversations are happening at a very advanced stage of disease, and oftentimes even in the intensive care unit, where it's often a little bit late to have those kind of conversations, because a lot of times when you get to the ICU, you're having things done to you rather than for you, and that might not necessarily align with the things that you want. A lot of people want to be comfortable, especially when they're hurting. And so oftentimes hospitals are not the most comfortable place to be. I've been in my share. I was an inpatient respiratory therapist for many years. I have seen a lot of things that you can't unsee, and I don't want that for myself. I hope to not have that with any of my loved ones, and that's why it's so important to have a lot of these conversations relatively early on, rather than when you're already in that moment and everybody's already stressed and worried and concerned and scared and everything else. So a couple of the big issues that we want to talk about when we're talking about some of these palliative care end-of-life issues, making your wishes known. The first thing is, what do I want? What do I want to happen to me? And this is where this paper comes into play oftentimes Hopefully we can see that okay. This is what's known as a do not resuscitate order or an advance directive. There are actually a couple of different kinds of advance directives. And one other disclaimer I should put out there is these are the kind of things where rules vary tremendously based on state, and I know we have a couple of international people who may be catching this. These kinds of documents and procedures do vary significantly based on your country and even based on your state. Usually not the locality, not at the county or city level, but they definitely vary by state as far as the regulations and all that stuff goes. So what I'm going to offer are some general examples and some things to keep in mind, but definitely make sure that you are discussing this with somebody more knowledgeable about your immediate circumstances and your local laws. So this basically lets somebody know if you are in a situation where for example, you've fallen at home and you're unconscious, or you're in the hospital and you can't speak for yourself. What do you want to have done for yourself? If there are, in the absence of any instructions otherwise, we, RTs, nurses, doctors, we will do everything in our power. We will use every piece of technology, every medication, everything within our power to keep you alive. Again, that is not always pleasant. That often involves putting a tube down your throat, putting you on a ventilator, a device that will force air into your lungs to help you breathe. It will involve a lot of IV tubes, a lot of tubes going into veins and a lot of other places. These things are not very comfortable. We often have to keep people very sedated in order to keep them even at a minimal level of comfort, which means, of course, that you're not being able to interact with a lot of the people that you would want to interact with. You wouldn't be able to necessarily tell us to stop. You wouldn't necessarily be able to talk to your family members. You wouldn't necessarily be able to make your actual wishes known. And that's why these documents are so important. With this document, you can tell people the exact level of care that you want, whether it's I don't want anything done for me, whether it's okay, you can give me some medications if my heart slows down a lot, you can give me some medications to try to keep it going, but I don't want the breathing tube. Maybe I want to have a non-invasive ventilator, but I don't want the tube. There are a lot of different things that you can do to put limits or put qualifications on the level of care that you want and what you feel is going to be most comfortable. As a clinician, I can tell you that a lot of times we will have what we call a modified code or a partial do not resuscitate, and these are often troublesome. Excuse me, because a lot of this stuff is designed to work together. You know, if we give you medications, they're not going to go anywhere unless your heart is beating. Your heart might not be beating unless we're doing chest compressions and making the stuff go. They don't do a lot of good if you're not breathing sometimes. So, of course, you aren't breathing if you're not on the machine. So, for myself, I look at it as either all or nothing. I would either want to have everything done or nothing, because we get into a lot of gray areas when we get into that in between. That is just me, though. You are absolutely entitled to whatever level of care that you are comfortable with and that you believe is congruent with your beliefs and everything else. But we need to make sure that that is communicated to whoever is taking care of you. And so these documents are very important to have on hand if you get admitted to the hospital, if you happen to be in a nursing facility, or even if you're at home. There are a lot of localities, a lot of states where you can work with your physician or other provider to make sure that you have this document here. I actually saw one, this particular document is from Illinois, I believe. I saw one that you can have at home that is signed by your physician that says, I certify this person is under my care. We have discussed this. For any emergency medical personnel that are responding to a call, this is what your instructions are. So that is a very powerful tool to make sure that you are comfortable and that your rights and your desires are respected, even when you're not necessarily able to speak for yourself. These orders do go by a couple of different names. Do not resuscitate, do not attempt resuscitation. One of the newer terminologies is allow natural death. There was a study done a couple years ago out in California that found if we called it that, then people were a lot more willing to consider it, willing to fill out the paperwork. Whatever we want to call it, this is one of the most critical pieces of information that you can you can have on hand so that your wishes are known and that we can respect that. At the same time, though, we don't necessarily just want to talk about the literal end of life and what we do to keep you alive and all that stuff. And that's why discussions about palliative care and hospice are so important. And there's a difference between the two. A lot of times they get lumped together, and that's kind of unfair because palliative care is a lot different than hospice. And we're going to talk a little bit about the differences here. Palliative care is something that I can go talk to my clinician about right now. I have a couple of chronic diseases. I have high blood pressure. I have, many of you may know, I've struggled with weight. I've had surgery. I've had bariatric surgery. And some of that stuff can make things a little bit complicated. It throws off hormones and things like that. So they are various chronic diseases. I used to have some more before I lost some weight. I had things like gout. I had a lot of those symptoms, a lot of those chronic diseases. Nothing as intense as COPD, of course, but still there were things that needed to be evaluated. And so you kind of have a decision between what we call curative care or care that is designed to fix a problem, and palliative care, which is care that is designed to make the problem easier to deal with. And so that's kind of where I was with my weight. I looked at palliative care where I could take all these medications like anti-high blood pressure stuff, diabetes stuff, all that kind of thing. That is theoretically more of a palliative thing. It keeps you out of pain, it keeps a lot of your vitals under control and all that stuff. There are also curative procedures, again, like the surgery, like having a lobectomy where you have some of your lung taken out. If you have lung cancer or something like that, you have some of those, or some of our surgical processes for COPD. Those are more curative things. Those are designed to actually fix the problem. Of course, in the attempt to fix the problem, sometimes we bring in other issues. Whenever you have surgery, you run the risk of infection. So we may go in to do this lobectomy and you get a surgical site infection, or we find other problems. And then you end up on a ventilator for a long time and you have a lot of other issues. A lot of times people just want to be comfortable, and so we can opt for the palliative measure. And again, that is something you can start at any phase of the disease. That's something I could start now. It's something, when we have kids who are young and we have cystic fibrosis and things like that, diseases of childhood, diseases that start in childhood. Palliative care is simply a measure to help keep you comfortable. You can have some curative things and some palliative things at the same time. But it's very important that you, again, start talking about your wishes for palliative care and then leading into what we want to do if we need to. If you encounter a situation where we might have to resuscitate you, it's important to make those wishes known. Hospice is a little bit different. Hospice provides a lot of palliative services and in some ways is kind of the ultimate level of palliative care, but it is specifically designed for the very end of life. According to Medicare guidelines, in order to qualify for their reimbursement programs for hospice, you have to be considered in the clinical judgment of your physician to be likely to pass within the next 6 months. That's not a hard and fast rule. It's not saying that if you make it longer than 6 months, you've done something wrong, or we're going to take your hospice away, or you're fraud, or anything like that. It's just the best guideline we can do, because as my good friend John Linnell is fond of saying, there is no expiration date printed on anybody. It is very hard, no matter what a provider will tell you, it is very hard to predict how long these things can go on. So with a reasonable guess, if we figure it's going to be 6 months or less, you can qualify for these hospice services. And hospice services, again, doesn't necessarily mean that you don't get it's not all just morphine or anything like that. I looked at just this morning at the Medicare guidelines. They cover occupational therapy, physical therapy, medical supplies, medications. Sometimes they even cover health aides, home health aides, and things like that. Respite care. They cover social work. They cover grief counseling and things like that to help talk you through the process. Hospice does not necessarily mean that things are done, you've given up, or anything like that. It just means that We know that the end is relatively near, and we want to make sure, again, that you are as comfortable as possible as we approach that and help you transition as easily as possible. And so again, very important to have these conversations early so that you can make sure that everything is as comfortable as possible for you. You are the most important person here. So that said, next up is trying to decide who will speak for me. You know, a lot of times people don't necessarily want to do the paperwork for many very valid reasons. You don't want to commit to that. You don't want to have to think about that. But it's also very important to have somebody, to designate somebody who, if you are in a situation like that, and you don't have that paperwork, or that paperwork can't be found, you want to have an advocate. You want to have somebody who is well aware of your needs and that you can trust to execute what you want done, and to respect everything that you believe in. And for that, we have this document. This is another example document. This isn't necessarily what everything is going to look like. I was my grandmother. I and my wife were both powers of attorney for healthcare and for financial reasons for my grandmother. And our document was much different than this. We actually went to a lawyer. All three of us, my grandmother, myself, and my wife, went to a lawyer and had a very comprehensive document drawn up, so that we could have what we call durable power of attorney, when we could act as my grandmother's agent in cases where she wasn't able to speak for herself. This is, again, a very powerful document. This is a very important document for people to have, because we want to make sure, again, that your wishes are taken care of when the time comes. What this is a document that you can have, I can believe you can have as many as you want, but it's usually reasonable to have one or two people who you trust very much, so that they can follow your wishes, and they will make sure that you are taken care of as you choose at the end of your life. This is something that somebody has to actively sign on. There are spots on this document, and on ours we had to actively accept the responsibility. We had to declare that we understood the responsibility. We had to declare that we would act according to her wishes rather than our own. And that's, again, to try to minimize the risk of, I guess you'd call it self-dealing, where somebody might be keeping you alive because they want to keep getting your Social Security check or things like that. But again, this is a very powerful document, so that somebody can speak for you in cases where you can't speak for yourself and you don't have that document. One of the things that I did not know, and I am learning, not at great cost, but at additional complexity, is this document does not survive your passing. The people you appoint to be your durable power of attorney, that power goes away when you are declared dead. Those people no longer have any legal right to act on your behalf. Those people don't have any control or power or anything like that. And that's why it's also important to get into our last talk here, which is what happens when you're gone. Again, that power goes away, that power of attorney goes away, whether it's for healthcare, financial, whatever it is, that goes away when you do. And so it's very important also to have the kind of traditional last will and testament, so to speak, to kind of declare what happens to you when you're gone. Even if you have a relatively small estate, my grandmother did not have a lot toward the end, but she had enough that we're actually in kind of we were over the basic limit. Now it's a little bit more complex, and fortunately we don't have a lot of other stuff going on, and she didn't actually have a lot of property or things like that, because then the state gets involved more, and it's very complex. But if you have one of these wills set up, you can very clearly designate where stuff goes and how stuff is going to be executed. Again, this is kind of your power of attorney for after you're gone. You set up what's called an executor, which that's part of the process that I'm going through right now. Is I actually, because I was not designated the executor, I have to go through a process to be declared the executor, because I'm the sole heir now. Well, I should say, even though I'm the sole heir, my grandmother only had one child, my father, who passed in 2003. And I don't have any brothers or sisters, so there's a very linear path between my grandmother and myself. But I still need to go through the process because we weren't aware and we didn't think about that beforehand. And so now I have to be designated the executor of her estate. A lot of times people look at this as a very complicated process, very expensive process. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. It does depend a lot on your individual case, your individual circumstances, your location, all that kind of stuff. There are do-it-yourself kits that are available online that can go as low as $10 that are very basic. If you don't have a lot of stuff, you're basically going to be declaring an executor and that's it. This probably would have been perfect for a case like ours where there aren't a lot of competing interests, there isn't a lot of property to be divvied up or anything like that. We just basically needed to put a rubber stamp on something and do that. Because we didn't spend that $10, now we're spending probably closer to $1,000 is what I'm quoted by our. We have a lawyer, the same lawyer who helped us with power of attorney stuff is helping us through the executor stuff. But obviously, it's a lot more time. It's a lot more time consuming and obviously a bit more expensive. You can, if you have a relatively complex case, or if you want to make sure that all of the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, you can go through a lawyer to get this set up. Depending on where you are in the country, that cost is going to vary wildly. What I was seeing is that average, it's somewhere between $150 to $400 or so. One site said the average was about $375. Again, not cheap, but important and probably cheaper in the long run for any of your heirs or anybody who is executing your estate down the road. And if those things are out of reach still, most localities have a legal aid department or a legal aid bureau where you can get some help. You can get lower cost. You can get free to no cost legal advice to help you get some of this stuff rolling, to help you get this in place, so that your heirs, while grieving, aren't also trying to deal with a lot of these complexities. And so the biggest takeaway here is that these are difficult conversations. Again, I can't repeat it enough. Nobody likes to talk about the end of your life. Nobody wants to look forward to that. Nobody wants to think about it. Nobody wants to believe it's going to happen. But it will happen. And it's very important to have these conversations relatively early on so that you have full control of your abilities, you have full control of being able to communicate to people, and you have full control to decide what you want toward the end of your life. Because only you can decide what you want. Again, if we don't have instructions, we are ethically bound to do whatever it is we can to keep you alive. That is the way our society has developed, for better or for worse. We are not allowed to impose our values on you. Personally, I think that's a good thing, because that's a very dangerous path. But it can lead to situations where I've seen situations where people have been on life support far longer than they want to be. I have seen situations where people are on life support for a long time because their family members can't decide what that person would really want. I have seen a lot of very difficult situations, and my hope is to prevent that from happening to anybody watching this, whether you're watching us live on Facebook, whether you're watching it on YouTube, whatever it is. My goal is to make sure that your wishes are respected and that you are taken care of as you want to be. So please, have that difficult conversation, have that complex case, swallow whatever you need to find that person you trust, whether it is a family member, whether it is a lawyer, whoever it is. Make sure that your wishes are spelled out very clearly through the advance directive, through the power of attorney, through the last will and testament, through whatever mechanism you can, so that you are respected and that you can transition to the next state as comfortably and with as much peace of mind as absolutely possible. So while that may seem like a little bit of a downer note to end on, I like to look at it as very optimistic, because the end time is the last time where you have total control over all that stuff. Who knows what happens afterwards, but you can control that, and that's your last chance to go out on a high note sometimes. So we'll try to find the silver lining there and make it as happy or at least as uplifting a note as possible. And that is our talk for today. This, of course, is question and answer time now, free to anybody on the floor here, whether it's one of our topics of the day, whether it's a news summary, whether it's whatever is on your mind. Let's go ahead and throw some of those questions out there. We are going to, I'm going to scroll back here and see what I can find out here with some of these questions. A lot of questions today. Appreciate everybody coming by. Like I said, I know this was a tough one to do, so we're going to go back. David asks, is it the vaping? We talked a little bit about Ecigs before. Is it the vaping or what you're vaping? Well, in this kind of case, it's probably very tightly intertwined. We don't know what the long-term effects of some of these chemicals are, and especially, you know, we've got Ecigs from the National we've got Ecigs from the national makers. We've got Ecigs from local juice bars or whatever you want to call them. We've got a lot of stuff out there, and we don't know what the long-term effects of that vapor are going to be. And so, whether it's the act, whether it's whatever is in it, we don't necessarily know. We do know from a practical standpoint that it's bad. Is it as bad as tobacco smoke? Again, doesn't seem to be, but the jury is still out on some of the long-term effects. So, let's see what else we got. A lot of people who have quit. Stomach problems. That is very true. I wish I could give everybody watching my pulse rate, my oxygen sats, and all that stuff. It would be fantastic. I have heard before, and I steal it. I can't remember who it is, but if I could go out of business tomorrow, if I had to find a new career field tomorrow, I would gladly do that, because that would mean that we have figured out COPD. We know what to do to treat it the greatest. Everybody knows what it is, how to prevent it, how to fix it, all that stuff. I would gladly give up everything that I'm doing right now if we could say that. So. Again, a good point. Oximeters can be useful. Try not to get too obsessed with them. One of the first things they teach us in RT school is to treat the patient, not the number. Sometimes you can have a really good SAT and still be short of breath because something else is going on. You might need to do some pursed lip breathing and that sort of thing. So again, one piece of the puzzle, one part of the picture, one of the things we look at to try to make sure that things are being taken care of appropriately. Janice has one of these that has a light in it. That can be also very good if you can find that. There are, like I said, a couple of different brands. Nanin, Massimo, those are the big ones. The clinical grade ones, they have a couple of that have different features and all that kind of thing. I wish I could buy one of each and try them all out, but I can't do that. And I want to make sure I'm staying as objective as possible. So not that anybody has yet offered, but I don't accept any of these things either. To just to make sure that everything appears to be fully on the up and up. I don't take sponsorship or anything like that. So. For clarity, this was the Nanin GoTo Achieve. You can get it, I believe you can get it on Amazon. You can do a search for it and find it in a lot of different places. This one was called the Massimo ISPO2. Again, through a couple different sources, they have a newer one out now that doesn't have a cable. It's a Bluetooth compatible thing. So you can find those at a couple of different places. So. Appreciate everybody, like I said, sticking out the difficult conversations here. David asks, why are people on hospice that might not be dying in a certain time frame? I know people that are under it because they just don't want to go to the doctor anymore. That is a possibility. It's not something that I see. I don't necessarily want to call that an abuse of the system, because I can definitely understand not wanting to go to the doctor anymore. But that's really more of a palliative situation. The true definition of hospice care, again, according to Medicare, is that you have 6 months or less. Again, not hard deadline, not that anything bad is going to happen to you if you make it past 6 months, but some people just get tired of the fight, and that is the perfect situation where we want to do palliative care. And unfortunately, even the medical side of things, we don't often, there are just, if you look at that that European Respiratory Journal article, there are just as many barriers from the clinician side as the patient side. We don't talk about it enough. People don't ask about it enough. It's a two-way street. We as clinicians often get caught up in the curative stuff. We want to make people better. That's why we do what we do. And sometimes it's difficult to acknowledge that we aren't going to make anybody better. We're just going to make you more comfortable. And sometimes that's a hard thing for us to deal with too. And so we try to put off that conversation on our end as long as we can also. So that's why a lot of times you get these people who we keep pushing, and somebody just says, you know what, that's enough. I don't want to go to the doctor anymore. And so that would be, like I said, more of an appropriate thing for palliative care than hospice, but sometimes they do get lumped together. So Janice mentions at a conference a few years back in DC, COPD readmissions. The conference also included End of Life done by Edna Shattuck. Good stuff, keeps confusion at bay. Thank you very much. It's always an honor to be even mentioned in the same sentence as Edna, who was a incredible force for the COPD community, a nurse, a respiratory therapist, a person with COPD herself, was fantastic. And unfortunately, she left us, I think going on a year ago now, maybe a little over a year ago. It's hard to remember because she left such a footprint on a lot of this stuff that it's sometimes hard to imagine that she's even gone. So thank you very much for mentioning that. I'm glad that she was able to talk on that stuff, and I'm glad we're able to clarify a lot that's going on. Does marriage act as all those documents, or should we get them as well? That would be a topic that you would want to discuss with somebody a little bit more knowledgeable with your area. Spouses have different rights depending on different areas. What I have found in my experience is that it's always best to get it in writing. Because sometimes you get a situation where a spouse has one view about what a resuscitation parameter should be, and children have a different view, and then you've got intra-family fighting, and while the person is being sick and just wanting to spend time with everybody, it's important to have those conversations with all of your family, but at the end of the day, I know it sounds a little bit cynical, but get it in writing too. That's my best advice, but again, your individual situation may vary, your individual locality, some of the regulations may vary, so best to get that checked out at your local level. Kathy mentions my philosophy, die young, as old as possible, and I love that. I'm a firm believer in you're only as old as you feel in many cases. I am fortunate enough that the older I get, the happier I am, and the more energized I feel, again, especially after some of the struggles I've had with some of my chronic diseases. Again, not to the degree of COPD or anything like that, but that positive outlook is incredibly important in a lot of these diseases, and in making sure that you're happy with your life. So if we can all stick with Kathy's philosophy there, we will all do very well. Of course, everybody is very welcome for time, and again, thank you for sticking with it today. Susan has something that she says is off topic. I've been dealing with an itchy rash that presents as red blotches under the skin on arms, legs, and torso. I think cardizem or prednisone could be culprits. Have you heard of this? Doctors don't seem to have an answer for me, and I would give my firstborn to stop this rash. Rashes are unpleasant. I am not a dermatology guy. I had my share of derm issues. I had the gangly teen acne and all that stuff, and I was happy to put a lot of that stuff in the rearview mirror. It could be, they could be culprits. I think probably prednisone might be a little bit more likely than cardizem, but everybody has different sensitivities to different molecules. I had, sometimes we have people who are allergic to an entire class of drugs, an entire class of antibiotics, an entire class of bronchodilators, an entire class of stuff. Sometimes people are allergic or sensitive to individual molecules in that class. So I think that's a reasonable guess for one of those two things. But it's unfortunate that the doctors don't have an answer, because they would be the ones that are best able to figure that out. Sometimes it takes looking back for a while and thinking, okay, I've had this rash for a month. I started cardizem a month ago. I bet those two are related, so maybe I'll talk to my clinician and say, hey, is there something else I can take that will solve the issue, and maybe try something in the same class or something like that, and see if the rash goes away. If it does, then you probably can lock down that was the problem. If not, then the search will continue. But I have heard of those things kind of happening before, but it's difficult to say from this distance, unfortunately. Thank you, David, for heading out. We're going to be wrapping up in a couple of minutes anyway. Head out and have some breakfast. Everybody else, I hope everybody else is going out and having good breakfast, good lunch, whatever it is. We got, if anybody wants to get any last-minute questions in, please feel free. We'll take a couple of questions here next week. What are we talking about next week? I had all these memorized, and now I can't remember. So I'm going to cheat, and I am going to look ahead. Next week, we are going to be talking about going under the knife. We have in the last few years a couple of different surgical and non-surgical, but non-pharmacological type of therapies involved for COPD. We had a comment in the group yesterday that a physician involved in, I believe it's the lung coils, got a call from the FDA that getting some information. This is a therapy that's been available over in Europe, but has not yet been approved here in the U.S. It's not a surgical procedure. It's what we call bronchoscopic. Spoiler alerts, we'll talk about that more next week. But we have a lot of other things that we can do for COPD that don't necessarily involve inhalers and that sort of thing. So that's going to be next week. After that, I believe we're going to be taking, we're going to be taking about 2 weeks off. Well, we're going to definitely be taking 1 week off. I will be on, that's our spring break, and I actually have the pleasure of joining my wife at one of her conferences. She has come to many respiratory conferences with me and has been a fixture at a lot of those, so we get to do some role reversal, and I get to accompany her to one of her bariatrics conferences out in San Diego. So if anybody is in the San Diego area, drop me a line and say hello, and we'll see if we can take a picture or something like that. That might be kind of fun. And then the week after that, I will be at the Michigan Society for Respiratory Care Conference doing a talk on care coordination, making sure that people are taken care of, again, not necessarily just at end of life, but all the way through their regular management, perhaps an emergency room visit or a hospital admission, and then back to the home. What we can do to help smooth out some of those barriers. I hope to get some of that going live, but can't promise that just because tech is always troublesome, especially when you're on location. But I'm going to see what we can do. I'll definitely be back by April 20th, where we'll be talking. I believe we're going to do a little bit of a review session, hit some of those medications that people like to talk about a lot. We haven't done a good med review lately, inhaler technique, all that kind of fun stuff, and we'll cover that at that time. Thank you, everybody, for stopping out today. Appreciate it. I've said many times this was a tough topic, but it's one that I feel is very important, critical, you might say, to making sure that you're taken care of when you maybe aren't able to take care of yourself. So I hope that we got some good information out there today, and I hope everybody goes out and does take care of themselves. I like to say, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you back here next week for COPD Navigator Live. Take care, everybody.